people say, well, where did Jesus go for what? Like between the age of 12 and 30. Maybe there's so much more to Christ than we don't know. Did he go to India? Did he go to Egypt? Well, that's only a gap of what? 21 years, and people are hesitant to really define Jesus. And here we are with a gap of 1,000 years, and we're making assumptions that we understand Ashtanga Yoga, for example, just from the standpoint of Patanjali. What if there was a reworking of it, a renovation of it somehow within the yoga traditions that are missing in the timeline?
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I'm really excited about our show today because our guest is someone that I've been trying to get on our show for quite some time, and it just never aligned perfectly. Well, it has today, and we've got him on the show. Our topic itself is an interesting one, particularly for myself as a teacher of modern yoga. Today, we're going to talk about the origins of modern yoga. And there tends to be two different schools on this topic. You've got people that categorically believe that yoga is this really ancient tradition, and then everything about it, including the physical postures, are ancient. And then there tends to be more of the line of, well, no, there's a few postures before, but most of it was created in the last 100 years or so by this guy named Krishnamacharya. A lot of that thinking is because of sort of popular thought, but also guys like Mark Singleton wrote a book in 2010 called The Yoga Body, where he talks about a lot of this and influences from other areas. And a lot of those things were coming from this idea that Krishnamacharya, who really is the grandfather of modern postural yoga as we know it, said that he got a lot of his postures from ancient texts. Well, the problem was that we didn't have any of these texts or didn't have access to them, so people just assumed that he was making it all up. Well, turns out he wasn't, and we actually have a lot of these source texts now, and thanks in large part due to the work of our guest. So our guest today is scholar, teacher, and yogi, Christopher Tompkins. Really happy to have him on the show. Christopher, welcome.
Thank you, my dear friend. And you can't take the blame in any way for us not having done this earlier. That's me and my wayward ways, but I'm here and quite honored, and I want to really mention here that you've been such a great part of inspiring my work, and I thank you for your friendship and support over the years. He built my website, but we won't go into that now.
Indeed. Well, that was good long time ago, and I've appreciated the work that you've done. And, I have to say, too, that I used to fall into the category of someone that would say, like, oh, yeah, most of these postures were just invented by a guy 100 years ago or so it's fine, it's not a big deal, and kind of perpetuated that same idea. And the work that you've done has really clarified that's not true, and that we've got this whole rich tradition of all these different postural practices, which I'm really curious and excited to get out there to our listeners and to the public at large. But before we dive into that, maybe you could tell our listeners a little more about your background, how you first got introduced to yoga, and how you got to become a scholar of Sanskrit and to be doing the work that you're doing now.
I was about 12 years old, and at the time my parents were divorced, living in different states, and I would visit my father, who at that time, at that age, had been just a really fun dad, and I didn't know what I was in for when I approached him or moved in with him for the summer, having had an experience that prior winter in upstate New York, where one day I was playing in the woods. It's actually skipping church, come to think of it. And there had been a fresh snowfall. And I'll never forget, from my, relatively immature brain and lack of life at that point, being suddenly just struck by the absolute silence of the forest after, again, this heavy, fresh snowfall. And I'd had that before. I'd remembered as a child how much I like sitting still in that. And I had one thought, which was, is there any sound in this forest at all? And something quite strange happened to me. I felt more alive than I had been. I felt a sort of electric feeling in my body, and a warmth spread through me that felt, as a 12-year-old, it felt like the embrace of, a real maternal sense of well-being. And I went in and asked my family, or I intended to ask them, is it possible to not think? And is that, when that happens, in our Catholic religion, does that mean God is close to you or something? Because I felt that. In fact, I simply had church in the forest. And one of my relatives was busy cooking, and I watched her face and her the limb movements and just her general sort of vibe. And I already knew the answer, that she had no idea what I was talking about, although had I probably experienced it before. And she turned to me and she goes, "No, your mind is always thinking. Now come here and help with this and do that." And it was a breakthrough moment. I didn't realize at the time that I experienced what the sages call yoga, meaning a noun. It's a state, right? It's a state in which that which obscures the unity connection with source consciousness, source, maybe Jesus consciousness, Buddha consciousness, whatever. But the source self, we might call the Atman, that which obscures it is the noise or the wind of the mind. And it's like Plato's cave. If you're looking at the shadow dancing, you don't see what's outside or beyond it. So I went to my father and saved the question, the same one 6 months later. Long story short, the rules of the house were that for a certain period in the morning, we were not to play upstairs near his bedroom because he was doing something called meditation, and had been at the time an initiate into Paramahamsa Yogananda's Kriya Yoga, a mantra-led 3-part pranayama practice, essentially. And he had, it was off limits, and you didn't want to mess with that. It was sort of like a stern rule. And of course, so I interrupted it every day, and I would sneak into his bedroom and hide quietly behind the bed. And I became fascinated with his breathing. It was incredibly slow, and I thought, gee, is Dad gonna, suffocate or asphyxiate? And yet there was a peace just coming out of that corner of the room, which was just absolutely stunning. And it reminded me of that day in the woods after the snowfall. But this is now summer in the state of Georgia. And gradually, every day I got a little closer. And as far as I can remember, there was like a memory gap between one day and the next, where I found myself actually seated before him, mimicking his breath. And he was doing 20, 30 count kumbhaka, pranayama, breath retentions. And it was just the most peaceful thing. And I'd hear these little whispers of sound, of vowels coming out of him. And I remember trying to imitate that. And there was a certain moment in that one morning when I seemed to have blacked out, and I was sitting before him, and a peace just irradiated from the center of my being that was greater than anything I'd ever felt. And I realized I'd never before really been alive.
At this point, did your dad know that you were coming in there and sneaking in there to watch him?
So here I am, and this is a classic moment for me of how yoga is defined in the tradition. And in my case, we all have moments of yoga. In that moment, I opened my eyes, and he was looking at me with a half gaze, kind of with a sort of drunken, intoxicated look, blue eyes piercing, looking down at me. And I remember this lazy thought came from about a mile away. Oh, I'm in trouble because I'm not supposed to be here. And I watched the thought kind of fly by like a bumblebee might do on a quiet summer day. And he looked at me, and I said, or I started to say, I'm sorry, I've come in here like this. And before I could do that, he said, I didn't think you'd come so soon. And so for the next, I was 12, so for the next 15 years, I was under his thumb, and he taught me this practice, and that was the beginning of my experience with yoga. And that was a moment of yoga, of course.
And then you eventually went to school and got a master's in Sanskrit, is that correct?
Well, first I did the School of Life, and I went to college, or was starting college, doing something completely not suited for me. And the first education that led to me deepening the practice was going to India looking for a guru, looking for a Yogananda. and instead I came back with dysentery, and was very upset, lost all this weight. But I did happen to experience one teacher who I was told was profound. For me, yoga was mainly a mantra pranayama practice. I was aware of the postural stuff, but this was the late 80s. It still wasn't a huge thing yet. And nonetheless, I was led to a place called Mysore, and I walked into a room full of white people, and there I met Sri Patabi Joyce and his wife and his son, and I practiced pretzel poses, as I called them at the time, for 1 month. And it helped, and it felt great, but something felt like it was missing, and it was only years later that I realized that there's different pieces that have been broken apart, and it's time to bring them back together. And yes, I went on to study Sanskrit at Harvard and UC Berkeley and Pune in India, and so I've been at it probably reading 5 times more Sanskrit than English even now, maybe 30 hours a week of source text for the last 15 years.
And now a lot of those source texts as well, you personally went to India, places like Kashmir as well, and got a lot of these texts. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, long story short, the scholars I worked with were very proficient and incredible Sanskritists, but I didn't really have a tantra or a yoga expert that I was working with. And so what happened was we had a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley in 2006 named Somadeva Vasudeva, the esteemed student of Professor Alexis Sanderson of Oxford, whom I regard as the greatest scholar alive of Tantra. And Somadeva not only taught me how to read tantras, which are very cryptic, but he gave me a massive download of typed-in e-texts from Sanskrit, mainly tantric manuscripts, that had been the work of many scholars in many different endeavors to preserve these texts over the years. So that was a download of thousands of texts. And then, yes, in addition to that, I've been collecting for years in Nepal and especially Kashmir in 2012. I went over and got about 35,000 scans of text once we felt it was safe to go in. And, really get scans of text left behind in the big exodus when the descendants of the tantrics had to flee in 1990.
And so, I mean, obviously there's a huge wealth of information there that I'm sure spans all kinds of different topics and ideas, but kind of tying it into the modern postural practice, what did you find in those texts that was relevant to yoga as it's more popularly practiced here in the Western world of the Hatha Yoga practices?
Like anybody else, probably all of us at some point, I'm thinking now, middle 2000s, right around 2006, while studying at UC Berkeley, my agenda was certainly to get to the source of all of it. And, incidentally, my father, who left his body quite uniquely in 2003 after a bout with cancer, which he had actually gone into remission from, a bone marrow cancer that was supposed to kill him in 6 months, and he double timed it with this practice and really went at it with these mantras and was determined to not go the route of others. A very fatal, quick cancer. And he lived 3 years and was almost completely cancer-free and left his body. And the highest experience I ever had in my life doing this practice was always with him. And the last day I saw him alive, we had one of the most cathartic, subtle body experiences, and I felt all the nadis in the body lit up with the energy that the sages talk about, and no one will ever tell me that this stuff isn't true. I felt it, and my father said, it's still incomplete. You have to find the rest of this practice in the source text, this mantra-led, what we thought of as mainly seated practice. And so that is worth mentioning because that was the agenda to go deep in the field that people have not gone deep into. If you look at most yoga history timelines, there's a massive gap. It's an awkward gap between, roughly the Yoga Sutra, usually dated around 3rd, 4th century CE, and then the advent of the so-called Hatha Yoga texts, which start popping up around the 15th century. So you have a 1,000-year gap in which no yoga tradition has really been recorded very well, with some minor exceptions. And to that point, we have a Hatha Yoga that is completely renunciant-based. It is anti-vinyasa, anti-women for that matter, that follows after the 15th century. So, where do we get this pro-life, pro-householder, postural-led movement practice from? That's the big question, and that's what I've been working on for years.
Well, and so a lot of people tend to associate the Yoga Sutras with the modern postural practice. I think a large part, Ashtanga was obviously one of the first styles, or we could even say perhaps brands of yoga when we're not talking about Patanjali's Ashtanga, but Pattabhi Jois's Ashtanga Yoga. And he very much connected his work with the Yoga Sutras. There tends to be that idea that Hatha Yoga is directly linked to the Yoga Sutras, which doesn't seem to actually stand up as much to history because of that huge gap that you're talking about. And that's what fascinates me so much, is recognizing the actual roots, because when you're listening to or you're reading Patanjali or reading the commentators, and then you're doing the modern postural practice, they don't really actually seem to connect very well. Patanjali seems more concerned with you transcending everything and averting your senses and all this sort of stuff. And then here you are in a typical yoga class and people are like, feel your body and breathe. And it's like, well, wait a second, isn't all this stuff, the illusory stuff that Patanjali is telling you get past? And it gets very confusing and muddled, which is why I think that this missing link of the tantras is so important. What were the kind of beginning stages of what you recognize between, here there really is a strong link between this modern practice and something that we had to or have at this point not really made the connection towards of these tantric practices?
Yeah, right. So this is all, it's an excellent question. Even before I answer that, and I certainly do have an answer to this very important question, just the fact, Ashton, that we don't have anything on these yoga timelines. So you take, for example, even with the what I think is one of the most significant events to ever occur, this International Yoga Day stuff that's been going on the last 2 days in India, even there, if you trace sources, they're not so interested in that. They're, of course, taking it on as a living heritage of householder practice. But everybody, whether it's Indians, whether it's Europeans, whether it's Americans, most scholars have this, as I say, this awkward gap. So, in a sense, who are we to write and publish anything with a gap like that? It's like saying, people say, well, where did Jesus go for what? Between the age of 12 and 30. Maybe there's so much more to Christ than we don't know. Did he go to India? Did he go to Egypt? Well, that's only a gap of what? 21 years, and people are hesitant to really define Jesus. And here we are with a gap of 1,000 years, and we're making assumptions that we understand Ashtanga Yoga, for example, the 8 limbs of yoga, just from the standpoint of Patanjali. What if there was a reworking of it, a renovation of it somehow within the yoga traditions that are missing in the timeline? Meaning to say, you very rightly pointed out, we have the Mysore school absolutely praising the Yoga Sutra. Ashtanga Yoga, some think, is named after the Yoga Sutra, that, the system of Pattabhi Jois. Certainly Krishnamacharya is all about it. Or is he? That's to say, if you look carefully at his Yoga Makaranda, his book, very strangely, you have 5 extra yamas, 5 extra niyamas, and they're practices that are not necessarily Patanjalian. They're much more ritual focused, they're life focused, they're physically focused, not really the vibe of Vairagya that Patanjali teaches. Where is he getting that from? Is it possible there are sources that did something with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra that are not so, let us say, politically correct to be discussing around the British Raj in 1930s India vis-a-vis Tantra? What were these tantras doing with these older yoga practices? And all you need to do, ultimately, if you can read Sanskrit and have, 1/4 of the interest in discovering this stuff as Krishnamacharya himself had, one quick glance at his source text tells you all you need to know about what Ashtanga Yoga really is for these people. And that's been one of the great moments for me in the last year, is unpacking that.
And so unpacking that, what was the great revelation? Like what came about that was so profound that you're now kind of a champion of this message and getting it out to people?
The real question is there a postural yoga system that has the various tenets and qualities, attributes that Krishnamacharya has given to us that somehow works in Patanjali's Ashtanga system? This is the key question. And, what we're really finding here, especially in the so-called Vaishnava Tantras belonging to the Vishnu worshipping division or lineage, tradition of the medieval tantric movement, modeling itself after the Shaiva or Shiva worshippers, you have this interesting competitive streak between the two lineages, both of which are competing for, initiates, for patronage, for royal patronage in particular, for example.
And if I can jump in before you continue with that, just for our listeners that might not know the difference, saying that, okay, well, we've got this common thread of the Tantras, but the different sides that you're talking about, the Vaishnava versus the Shaivites, or versus might not be the right word, but in contrast to, two of the sort of three main deities of Hinduism, even though there's thousands upon thousands of these deities, are Shiva and Vishnu, and which one you put at the top is kind of what we're talking about. So for the Shaivite Tantrikas, they're looking as Mahashiva as the great personification, and so their language is all coming based on that, versus the Vaishnavas are talking about Vishnu as that supreme being, and then Shiva's still there, Vishnu's still there in the other conversations, but it's just kind of like where do we take the top level? Would you say that's an accurate kind of very simplified version of those differences?
Yeah, I mean, really the essence is, I think the thing that's really going to be helpful for students is to really focus on the similarities. You have one single ritual yoga system shared by many different sub-lineages of Tantra, meaning to say a daily ritualized yoga practice which has come down to us in pieces today. And that practice generally is given the name Yoga Vidhi, Vidhi. Vidhi meaning something similar to vinyasa. It means a ritual sequence. So as many will realize that, India is a very puja-oriented devotional culture of temple worship. But what if this is an internal practice where you are attuning with a sense of deity that's not even anthropomorphic, although on the surface he or she might be? So you have tantric lineages that worship Shiva, that worship the goddess, that worship Vishnu in his various forms, like Krishna and Rama. But ultimately, what goes beyond that is all of these deities are nothing more than Shaktis, energies. And that energy is typically focused on the power of mantras, the liberating, transformative power of certain syllables when actualized with breath, movement, visualization. This is the Yoga Vidhi, the daily practice of engaged ritual that is meant to transform you from limited consciousness to that of awakened consciousness. So the deity name, the lineages are just different on the surface. And I should mention, Buddha's Vajrayana as well. But it's like they all, as Professor Sanderson says, they all share the same basic blueprint or format, and all you have to do is change the names of the deities and the mantras. But the daily practices, from bathing in the river to doing Surya Namaskar to blessing the directions to eventually asana vinyasa, all of these traditions are sharing the same basic, well, we could call it vinyasa flow. Hope that helps with that question.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So what we have then is a very interesting development, and this is, I'm bringing up the Vaishnava or the Vishnu worshippers. Imagine for a moment, just taking it into real time. As a scholar, one has to always seek to understand what the culture was like, what their aims were in these practices, who was listening to reading, receiving the teachings of the tantras. You have to sort of come out of your ivory tower, especially those of us in the West, armchair, what is this all about kind of perspective, and actually imagine who your audience is. Now, everybody in the tantric movement is pro-Vedic, for example, honoring the ancient roots of the Vedas. But they claim that this new yoga ritual, which can cause liberation within one lifetime, is a refined sort of next evolutionary step of ritual that is now internalized and made physical. So everybody's going to do that. But how do we show as Vaishnavas, that our yoga's got an extra little twist on it? How can we impress royal patronage? How can we show that our revelation is a little bit more Vishesha Shastra, a little bit more refined than the Shaivas, who had been around for centuries? So beginning around the 10th century, the Vaishnavas did something which I find to be incredibly brilliant. Okay. So basically, around the year 1000, 1100, particularly in South India, you have what I like to call a complete renovation of what had been a daily yoga practice that was basically emulating the Vedas. You get up in the morning, do your Gayatri mantras, but the fires you would light are now internalized. They're the fires that are conflagrated out of the breath retention of the sun and moon, for example. The three-part pranayama practices and the engagement choreographed with mantra, creating that hatha friction in the central channel in order to break open blockages holding lifetimes worth of stuck karma. Everybody's doing that, but it's a practice that is still kind of esoteric, and you want to cultivate a sense of hegemony and connection to all of society. So what do? What happened was, in this wonderful moment in a Vaishnava Tantra, Vishnu worshipping Tantra, very little known, called the Prajna Samhita, which means the question mark. You have a yoga chapter. It's I believe it's 33rd chapter, which begins like normal. It talks about how this is a mantra-based yoga, that you do these rites and ablutions in the morning, and it has this famous verse, which is simply, in English, very, very famous stock verse. One should stay away from those who seek to pollute the practice. These are like rules and injunctions. Prohibitions include doing away with the Vedic outside fires, which you would light morning, noon, and night. Instead, we're going to ignite the soul fire, and morning, noon, and night become sun, moon, and fire and kundalini. So it's like this refined practice. In addition to that, you should practice the vidhi, meaning the ritual sequence beginning with bathing in the morning with mantras and sacred water from the river, Ganga water, perhaps, and the preliminary rites that end with pradakshina, Surya Namaskara is implied there. And that particular chapter, the Prajna Upanishad, or Prajna Samhita, rather, references that there's a whole big, to-do about this prostration sequence. Well, there's like 5 other chapters in this tantra that just talk about the sequence of poses, linking the solar mantras, hrang, hring, hrung. These are the vinyasas. A vinyasa always refers to a sequence of sounds that perhaps have body parts following them. So a whole sub-trajectory of body movement. But back to the yoga chapter. So it mentions, hey, that's what you do next. It's talked about in other chapters. And this is our vidhi, our daily sacred ritual. And then a few verses later, it says, the key innovation of us Vaishnavas is that our mantras have the added addition, they're the added power of Lakshmi, who is, of course, Vishnu's consort, but here it's that sense of auspicious power that's drawn into the body. Kundalini, by the way, in no tantric text is anywhere but everywhere and always descends from the crown of the head where she's coiled like a sleeping serpent, right? Because she is the power of breath. In breath moves down, out breath moves up. This is
which would be contrasted with the more popular idea that Kundalini is at the base of the spine instead of the crown, correct?
That's right. And here's a hint to the audience. The word Shakti means energy. Energy isn't dormant. Yeah, the whole sense of Kundalini is a different topic, but just to say that this power in the Tantras coils and uncoils. This is a trick question. What coils and uncoils 21,600 times a day in your body? And there you'll have your answer. And it starts from from outside the nostrils, but in the subtle body from on top of the crown of the head. She breathes you. And when she's harnessed in these moments of kumbhaka, she's held in that moment of coil. You do not find her that way. It's a simile. The late Hatha Yoga text took the simile away and made her a serpent that was asleep. And nobody bothered to ask, how did a serpent get into my body and fall asleep near my rectum? It's from the standpoint of the Tantras, I make no tongue-in-cheek joke about us being ignorant because this is what we've been fed. But the people that taught us this whole dormant serpent thing were originally called the Malinas, the distorters by the Tantras, and that's a whole nother interview. Back to our moment here in this important chapter. So Prajna Samhita says, our mantras, when done with this kumbhaka, have a particular special effect that the Shaivas don't quite have, because Shiva's a little aloof, and Vishnu, likes to come and engage like Krishna, but here in the body. And what we're going to do, in addition to what the Shaivas do, is bring in a more potent form of the mantras. We're going to personify the Shaktis that represent those core seed mantras in the 8 directions around the mandala. And these are the fierce goddesses of old. So our mantra-based system of practice, where we move these kundalini mantras up and down, are now full of what's called hatha, force. So Hatha Yoga is introduced for one of the first times as a synonymous phrase to mantra yoga, meaning the application or the practice of mantra is now the application of a particular hatha, or combination of force. And that force is, and here's the big drum roll, Prajna Samhita says, the added force that we have is called Ashtanga Yoga Sadhana. This is an unpublished tantra, Ashton. So what does it mean? And there we have the beginning of what is the tantric renovation of the 8 limbs of Patanjali. A tongue-in-cheek renovation of what was once a practice of vairagya, withdrawing Purusha, or the soul, from this physical encasement of the body. The Vaishnavas deftly reincorporated the still popular Yoga Sutra, but made it a householder-based system, and added a couple of extra moves and niyamas and yamas. And I'd like to just briefly refer to one of those passages here really quick, which is, I'll give you the name of the text in just a moment. But this is a passage in one of many passages that qualifies Ashtanga Yoga within the context of Hatha Yoga. And by this I mean yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, etc. The goddess spoke and she said, this is a passage from a related text. Here we go. Ashtanga Bedena Shunuswa Kama Premaya Bhavaya Jayaka Bakshye. Listen to these 8 limbs as I teach you, the goddess of great bliss said. The yogi is one who engages the physical world. He should proceed through this practice first by the ritual of becoming physically empowered and strengthened. I will teach you specifically those sandhyas, or junctures of the day, where it's auspicious to gather strength in the body. I will teach you how asana flows as the niyama, called niyamasana, where the asana or thrones that we worship around the mandala, O Bhairava, correlated to the 12 months of the sun, become the namaskara, in which the sun is drawn down to earth, and I, the goddess, into your body. There are 12 moments or poses where I, the Shakti, the instrument of power, is drawn down through the wind, engaged through movement. Ahimsamam, satyam, suvakya, supriyamashteya, bhavam kurute, vashishtawat, and so forth. Now, there are 12 yamas, 12 niyamas. These are the practices. The sadhaka that always circumambulates practicing the niyamas, experiences the samtosha manastiram, that gratifying nectar of immortality in his or her prostration. There are 14 niyamas taught in all the tantric scriptures. They are indicators of the auspiciousness of one's devotion and ritual. As taught earlier, one is to perform the last of these niyamas called pujanam, worship, now with the asanas in the fast manner, those that move with great dexterity, those that jump through the legs, those that prepare one for reclining, those that prepare one for sitting, and those which pranam one to the earth. This is our niyamasana, not to be confused, she says, with ashtangam asanam tritiyam, the third limb, meaning asana when one sits still. That's one of 6 chapters from the Rudra Yamala Tantra, which fully and totally incorporates what it calls Tantric Ashtanga Yoga Sadhana from Yama all the way to Samadhi. And this is Krishnamacharya's #1 source, listed in his 1934 bibliography as an inspiring text for his revival of Yoga Vinyasa.
Well, and what I'd like to do, because I think that's it's a powerful statement that the text is making, but I think it's for our more perhaps casual or newer yogis to give a little bit of that context of how significant that actually is, because in the more let's say classical yoga, the Samkhya philosophy of Patanjali, or even the Vedas. I mean, the Vedas and people that you had the Brahmins that were doing these rituals that you spoke of, and most of this is all external ritual. It requires a priest to do it for you if you're not a priest. And here you've got these people that are saying, well, no, let's make that ritual an inner ritual so anyone can do it. Is that kind of, is that accurate to say that now we're shifting from something that went to just the priests, and now we're talking about householders, but about everyone really, because anyone can do these inner practices?
Yeah, that's right. And originally, there is a sense that it was more of what's called antar yaga, internal worship, or, in essence, we have to rethink what it is we're working with. We have a unique tradition known as Tantra, unique for a reason that very few are aware of. It is the first tradition in which the deities are not anthropomorphic anymore, though they may be secondarily to their primary. They are called mantra devatas. In essence, these people discovered that choreographing mantra, and this is why the Ashtanga system was brought in, essentially what was added in was a whole litany or retinue of seed mantras that were engaged with the limbs of Patanjali, and it becomes what's called the vinyasa. Patanjali has no vinyasa, he just has an outline, a darshana of a system that could be applied, like a menu with ingredients, and not directions on how to cook them specifically. And that practice was public, but really just for male renunciants. You're talking about priests. The priests were the first to engage this stuff, but with the advent of the Bhagavad Gita and, slowly different classes or castes of society were able to practice. What is totally revolutionary about the Tantras is that the very preliminary daily rite, for instance, of Surya Namaskara, has one major function in the early Tantras. It removes caste and karmic blockages due to birth. You literally rise off the ground having been purified of past karmas and even attaining chittavritti nirodha through chanting, through bowing, through prostrating. And before you sit and do the internal practices, therefore, there is no priest. There is no Shudra, the lowest class. There's no outcast. There's just the conduit of God, which is the goddess. So you have this householder-based system where you keep your day job. There's still asceticism, but it's really looked down upon in favor of a society of yogis who are led by a dharmic king, the old idea of Rama from the Ramayana, but now tantric. And so you have these great, for example, tantric initiations. You have great utsavas or prostration ceremonies that supposedly whole communities were doing together.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it this far. Chris and I were enjoying our conversation so much that we actually chatted ourselves into another episode. So we're going to end here today, and we will continue our conversation next time. I hope you'll join us. Thanks for listening today. I hope you have a present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.